productivity is hardly a new phenomenon. We've always mismeasured it, partly because many benefits of economic change are impossible to calculate, and partly because statistics always lag changes in the economy. He offers a telling example.
The automobile was invented and first put into service in the year 1900. And by 1929, the ratio of motor vehicles to American households had reached 90% in just those 29 years. The price of a Model T Ford fell by 80% between the time of its introduction in 1910 until 1923. When were automobiles introduced into our price indexes and therefore into our GDP? In 1935, after all of the great price reductions and quality improvements had already occurred. Not to mention the fact that the replacement of the horse by the motor vehicle rid the streets of the manure and the urine poured out in gallons and tons in every city of the world, and neglected the benefit of the cure of diseases that came with that, and with the clean water. The benefits of improved life expectancy in the first half of the 20th century outweigh all other gains in consumption. So we're not talking about some new era of mismeasurement. We have a long history of mismeasurement.
Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate economist at Columbia University, argues that even if the new technologies are powerful, their puzzling impact on average productivity is not the biggest issue. The clue to what he thinks is lies in the title of his latest book, The Price of Inequality.
I don't think we can have much confidence predicting whether productivity is going to be lower in the next 20, 30 years than it was in the last 30. And yet it's clear that it's had a big effect on the way our society functions. The internet has had a big effect. Maybe these revolutions are not as fundamental as electricity, but they are still fundamental. That's not the key issue. The key issue is really the issue of what's happening to standards of living of most citizens. And that's where I think the fundamental issue facing our society is that of inequality.
We know that people's frustrations run deeper than these most recent political battles. Their frustrations rooted in their own daily battles to make ends meet, to pay for college, buy a home, save for retirement. It's rooted in the nagging sense that no matter how hard they work, the deck is stacked against them. And it's rooted in the fear that their kids won't be better off than they were. They may not follow the constant back and forth in Washington or all the policy details, but they experience in a very personal way the relentless, decades-long trend that I want to spend some time talking about today. And that is a dangerous and growing inequality and lack of upward mobility that has jeopardized middle-class America's basic bargain, that if you work hard, you have a chance to get ahead. I believe this is the defining challenge of our time.
As President Obama made clear in a speech in December 2013, the fact that so many people appear not to be sharing in what economic gains there are has become a growing source of social and political anxiety. However, even experts disagree on the desirable remedies. Joseph Stiglitz again.
What is of increasing concern is that the United States and many other countries are not the lands of opportunity that they would like to think of themselves as being. In some cases, there's some evidence that they're increasingly becoming less of a land of opportunity. What that means is that the income of a young American is more dependent on the income and education of his parents than in other advanced countries. And let me emphasize that we are paying a very high price for this inequality, and especially a high price for this inequality of opportunity. It means those at the bottom will not be able to live up to their full potential. We are, in effect, wasting our most valuable resource, our human resources. And opportunity, I believe, is a fundamental value held by not only most Americans, but most people in the West. Give you one example. Well-educated people, if they can't get jobs, are not going to do very well. And the high levels, particularly of youth unemployment in many of the European countries, mean that simply educating more individuals for unemployment is not going to solve the inequality problem or the growth problem.
I believe very strongly that inequality is a serious problem, but it needs to not be addressed with the politics of envy. The best ways to reduce inequality are to level people up, not to level the top 1% down.
Larry Summers of Harvard University was Treasury Secretary to Bill Clinton and economic advisor to Barack Obama. Faltering productivity and growing inequality might make it impossible to keep the promise of ever-rising standards of living. Yet there is an additional worry: people's unwillingness or inability to buy what we can produce. Larry Summers caught this worry by injecting the phrase secular stagnation, first used in the Great Depression of the 1930s, into current debate.
If you look at the industrial world over the last 15 years, there's very little evidence of growth with sustainable finances. Start with the United States. We have had growth, but rather limited growth, after a major decline. Japan hasn't grown in a way that Japan would traditionally have regarded as satisfactory in more than 20 years. Europe grew quite impressively in the first decade of this century, but it's now clear that that was financially unsustainable growth, and European growth in recent years has been miserable. And so the reality, the painful thing we have to recognize in the industrial world is that we seem to have great difficulty squaring adequate growth with sustainable and attractive financial conditions. And that's what I mean when I've invoked the term secular stagnation. But I'm convinced that a crucial part of the story is that entrepreneurialism and innovation require less capital than they once did. When General Motors was in its heyday, it was borrowing and issuing equity in order to invest massively in capital. Something similar was true when GE or even when IBM was in its heyday. Facebook has grown into a company that's worth more than the entire American automobile industry, starting with capital in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and with very little capital investment. WhatsApp has 55 employees and a market value that exceeds that of the Sony Corporation. The technological behemoths of our day, think of Apple and Google, aren't borrowing money. They have more cash than they are able to deploy. And so this change in technology leads to the ability to build great companies without massive investments.
So modern technology undermines demand by weakening spending on investment. It also affects how income and wealth are divided.
In a world where all the output will be produced by robots, the key question is who owns the robots?
Thomas Piketty, professor at the Paris School of Economics, has made a big splash with his new book, Capital in the 21st Century. This is an exhaustive study of the ups and downs of inequality over the last 3 centuries. Professor Piketty points to the rising share of capital at expense of wages in national income, particularly in Europe, over the last few decades. He also shows that compensation of top workers, those he calls the supermanagers, has exploded upwards in the US and, to a lesser extent, the UK. How does he explain these developments?
Changes in technology and education are not enough to explain what we observe. They certainly matter, but this is not enough because it's very difficult to explain why the rise of top labor incomes has been so much concentrated in the US and within the top 1%. You know, it's not as if people at the level of the top 1% are a lot more educated than people just below them. So in order to explain this, I think you have to analyze how top executive compensation are being set. And I think a big part of the explanation in the US has been a change in the way top executive compensation is set, and in particular the change in tax rate at the top of the distribution, which used to be extremely high in the US, which was of the order of 70-80% for very, very top incomes until the 1970s. Suddenly, they were reduced to less than 30% in the 1980s and then stabilized around 30-40% in the past 30 years. And we believe, on the basis of the evidence we have, that this has completely changed change the name of the game in terms of pay setting process at the top end of the distribution. When the tax rate is 30%, your incentives to get 1 more million and put the right people in the right compensation committee to get 1 more million, your incentives to do so are much bigger. And this is certainly not the only explanation for what has happened, but I think it will be naive to imagine that this plays no role. And at least this gives a chance to explain why this huge rise of very top labor incomes had happened in certain countries, typically the US, and not in others like Germany or Japan or Denmark or France, where information technologies have also been implemented.
All these complex changes will transform how our economies and societies work. Diane Coyle of the consultancy Enlightenment Economics argues we must confront difficult political choices in response.
These technologies create global markets and winner-takes-all kinds of phenomena. So if you are a lawyer or an author, you can now reach a much bigger global market, and that increases the earnings that you can access dramatically. Those are the driving forces. They're not going to go away, but then they interact with politics and political choices and with social effects as well. The decision in the 1980s on both sides of the Atlantic to cut top tax rates and reward innovation then amplified these technological driving forces. And they get embedded because once people start to have that kind of wealth, that translates itself into political wealth. And that in turn builds itself into the way that finance was regulated and the market power that the banks have and the kind of executive salaries that people at the top of large companies can set themselves. And I think all of those things have come together and are driving the extreme income inequality that we see now.
This sounds actually rather dystopian. Yes, we've got lots of new technologies and that's fun, but the way you're describing it is almost as though the great majority of the populations of the developed world are on the economic scrap heap.
I think you can choose to be pessimistic or optimistic about it, because if a large part of it is being driven by institutions and political choices, then you can make different choices and build different institutions. We can choose what assets to tax or whether corporate law can allow executive pay to be set in the ways it has been set. And if the executives say, well, all our best people will be competed away to somewhere else, well, let's test that.
A controversial proposal on how to balance compensation between the 1% and everyone else is to go back to the high taxes previously levied on the upper income classes. That suggestion will bring howls of outrage in some quarters and delight elsewhere. But is there a right level of tax that should be collected from society in order to spread wealth more evenly? Thomas Piketty again.
It's important to remember that the kind of 70%, 80% tax rate that were imposed in the US between the 1930s and the 1970s were imposed on very, very high labor incomes. It will be the equivalent of, $1 or $2 million today. If you were to impose those tax rates at $200,000 or $300,000, I think it will be a big mistake. Now, if you impose them at 1 or 2 or 3 million, I think that not only this is viable, but what history shows is that, in fact, you sometimes have higher productivity growth in the time periods where you have such tax rates than what we've had since 1980. If you do it well and do it only for income levels